Welcome. My name is Monica Twinar. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Sustainable Global Enterprise at the S.C. Johnson College of Business here at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. We're so glad you've joined us for this great hour of programming we've put together, talking about innovating with purpose. Can entrepreneurship expedite sustainable impact? We have a fabulous lineup of speakers. But before we jump into our conversation, I thought I'd give a quick overview of the center. In 2024, the center will be celebrating its 20th anniversary. For nearly 2 decades, the center has been conducting applied research and teaching on the growth opportunities companies pursue through competitive strategies that address the world's most pressing social and environmental challenges. We work with firms to identify innovative, entrepreneurial, and new business alternatives they can implement to tackle the grand challenges of our time, such as climate change, ecosystem degradation, and poverty. We offer a number of programs, events, and activities for residential students and offer one of the leading MBA programs with an emphasis on sustainable global enterprise. In addition to the Cornell keynotes that we host throughout the year, like this one, on November 17th, we'll be hosting our annual energy conference in person in New York City at the Cornell Tech campus, which will be open to the public. Look for more details about that in the coming weeks on the center's website. If you're interested in learning more about business and sustainability, we have launched an online sustainable business certificate program through eCornell that is available to the general public. The next one starts on August 23rd. We have also developed a self-paced online certificate program focused on sustainable tourism destination management. You can find both of these on the eCornell website. Now, let's turn to today's conversation. I want to take a moment to thank our partners, Diane Caldani with the CSG Group and Renee Bonamy, an alum of our program, with the Bonamy Desenvolvimento Empresarial, for making today's conversation a reality. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Renee.
Thank you, Monica. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to host this webinar together with Monica Tunard from the Center of Sustainable Global Enterprise at Cornell Johnson and Diane Caldani from the CSG Group. During my time at Cornell pursuing my MBA and throughout my career, my purpose has always been to connect entrepreneurship, innovation, and sustainability, and especially learn how innovative and sustainable businesses and projects get funded. Today, we'll have a great discussion on the topics I just mentioned with outstanding panelists. And I want to personally thank the center, all the speakers, the eCornell team who helped us enormously in putting this webinar together. Especially, I want to thank CSG's group's interns, Nika and Sini, 2 Cornell MBAs who are working with us this summer. Thank you all for attending this webinar. I hope you enjoy it. Diane will continue with the introductions.
Thank you, Renee. Welcome, and thank you for taking the time to join us today. As Chief Strategy Officer of the CSG Group, I'm pleased to bring you today's presentation in collaboration with Renee Bonomi and Monica Tunar of Cornell's S.C. Johnson Business School Center for Sustainable Global Enterprise. It's great to do this again with you all. Our fascination with entrepreneurship and venture capital has not waned, and the number of startups per year continues to grow. What has changed is that today's founders are eager to include a social or environmental focus to their business plans. Yet the failure rate of startups hasn't improved and is often overlooked by the hype that venture capital encourages. The challenges faced by founders are enormous, yet how can sustainable entrepreneurship thrive without robust businesses? Is there a way to change the narrative to ensure a more merit-based funding process to capitalize innovation? Today's discussion will explore the idea of sustainable entrepreneurship and impact investing within an ecosystem that may need to reinvent itself to produce the results it promises. And now I'd like to thank and introduce you to our esteemed panelists for their participation. Carrie Freeman, co-CEO of Second Muse, Fabrice Testa, entrepreneur and investor, and Joe Milam, founder of Angel Span, along with our distinguished moderator, Dean Hand, the Chief Research Officer at the Global Impact Investing Network, GIN as it is known. Dean, thank you for leading the discussion and sharing some of your recent findings on impact investing.
Thank you so much, Diana. It's nice to be here, and hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be here moderating this panel with our panelists, Carrie, Joe, and Fabrice, all of whom have a very strong pedigree in the entrepreneurship space. It's an honor to be in your company, as well as that of our audience as well. At the GIN, we are deeply invested or attentive to building an impact investing ecosystem around the world at scale and with integrity. And just to be clear, impact investing as a viable investing strategy focuses on three elements of it. One, investments that have an ex-ante intention to solve for a defined social or environmental challenge. Two, most crucially, probably, to measure outcomes relative to that theory of change. And number three, manage investments throughout the investment cycle to achieve those impact priorities, goals and targets alongside the financial priorities, goals and targets. This is a strategy that we've seen applied across all asset classes, private and public. In fact, some of our most recent research, I'll post the link in the chat in a moment, says that some of the fastest growing asset classes for impact assets under management are actually coming from the public space. From early stage to mature stage investing, and over 3/4 of all investors seek market rate risk-adjusted return, however you define market rate. While this is a broad applicability across asset classes and stages of business, while it's great, it is entrepreneurs, and especially at the early stage, and the venture angel investors that often back these entrepreneurs with equity and other forms of capital that offer powerful solutions, innovation, and market disruptions that are crucial to addressing some of our most intractable challenges, particularly if we are to address the goals laid out by the UN SDGs and, of course, the Paris Climate Accord. While issues such as corporate or business sustainability and considerations of ESG risk factors are important and often deal with the same subject matter, it is the promise of impact investing that has the potential to build a more just and sustainable world for all. Because entrepreneurs are often driven by the desire to solve problems and address unmet needs, they are the crux of the innovative solutions that promote sustainability, such as renewable energy technologies, eco-friendly products, waste reduction systems, to name a few. They also play a significant role in expediting sustainable impact, provided that either the entrepreneur or the investor that invests into them has an impact target and manages progress to realize that intention, in the same way that financial performance or potential is targeted, measured, and realized. What I particularly love about the role that entrepreneurs play in innovating with purpose is their capacity to transform markets. Entrepreneurs have the potential to disrupt the traditional and shift market preferences, consumers and institutions, and move towards more sustainable options. This can create a positive ripple effect as other companies may follow suit to remain competitive. So with that as a bit of context, let's get into the discussion of how entrepreneurs expedite sustainable solutions. And Carrie, I'd really like to start with you, if I may. At Second Muse, you support an extraordinary number of businesses who focus on climate solutions in particular, as I understand it. Please, can you help make this real for our audience? And can you share some of the examples of perhaps your favorite businesses and what stage they're at and why you might invest in them, or why you might support them, I should say.
Yes, thank you, Dean. We do. We work with, I would say, thousands of change makers and innovators each year. from a second use perspective, and we do it at a global scale. In New York, specifically, one of the programs that we work with in partnership with other organizations, including NYSERDA, so when you talk about government agencies, is the For Climate Tech program. And with that one, so yeah, you can look that up. With that one, we're currently supporting in our venture scale, our venture stage program, 20 different innovators. And this is very early stage innovators. And I'm not going to say a single one that's my favorite. I engage with and look at hundreds a year. So, that's kind of saying like, well, which one's your favorite? There's a lot of really good ones. But I do think that when you look at some of the things that are most impressive, it's people that are trying to solve problems, whether that is eliminating single-use plastics, whether that is making solar panels more efficient, whether that's making building materials more efficient, whatever it is, they're looking at a very specific problem. And then they're going after a market that's seen. And so I think of it oftentimes, what I get excited about is seeing the innovative ideas that people are coming up with. Some of them are technical, and honestly, some of them are behavior change. Some of the stuff that we really see, and I think if you look at the reports and studies, that behaviors coming from consumers and clients, clients, consumers, customers, is actually the biggest determinant. So yes, we need innovators, but at the end of the day, we need people doing behavior change. And so there are different times when we support innovators who are really targeting behavior change models through their solution. And so there's a whole host of different things. And I think we just need to continue to look at the breadth and also look at the leaders who are doing this, right? And do they have the right team composition? So that's no different than any other type of investment.
Thank you, Carrie. Some great examples there. And I also particularly like that behavior change part of it as well. It's so important in this space. Fabrice, if I can turn to you, you literally wrote the book on entrepreneurship and getting crazy ideas off the ground. So why don't you share some examples? I know when we were preparing for this call that you gave me one that was particularly poignant at the moment. But I also want to understand from you, when you talk about that example, what some of the biggest challenges are to scaling, or at least achieving viability.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Dean, for the question. Look, my book is about, it's called Super Entrepreneurship Decoded, and I wanted to see what some entrepreneurs are doing in order to really materialize crazy ideas to solve some big problems. Because the problem today, and I think if we want to create an impact, we have to go beyond, the conventional solutions that have shown their limits. And it's time for crazy ideas. So what is a crazy idea? A crazy idea has to have three characteristics. First, it is radical. So the solution is really groundbreaking. It really breaks the status quo, and it seems unfeasible at first, but actually we can make it. And I show in the book that many solutions that initially we thought that it will not be possible to make it, we can make it. Because there is now, a good level of advance in many technologies that make this possible. Then the solution, the idea must also be impactful. So it's not just radical, it has the potential to bring a real transformation and impact the society, the environment, or eventually, our daily lives. And finally, the solution has also to be disruptive. So it has to really improve things by an order of magnitude. We are not looking at some incremental, let's say, solution, but something that really has the potential to accelerate human progress. And this is really what we call a crazy idea. So just to give you some examples, for example, I'm a small investor in a company called Aurora Tech. It's based in Germany. And what they do, they make detection of wildfires by using infrared. And the beauty of their solution, they use satellite imagery, but the beauty of their solution is that they can detect very, very early the wildfires. We know today with all the extensive wildfires that we are facing that this is something that is very urgent. And to be honest, they are very successful because today they are just overwhelmed by the demand for that. The other solution is a company called Man Electric, and I'm one of the co-founder of the company. And what we do the production of solar panels directly locally. And for example, in Africa, if you want to get solar panels, it can be very expensive. And also you cannot control the quality of the panels that comes from China. So here what we propose is that the solar installers, developers, they can produce themselves with a machine very easy to control and to monitor. They can produce themselves the solar panels that are, of course, much greener, cheaper, and and of better quality overall. Now, regarding, let's say, your question about the biggest challenge in order to scale and to be viable, I think that funding is a big problem because usually the materialization of such crazy ideas requests a lot of funding. And to attract funding, and it's something that Carrie mentioned previously, the innovators, they must show some commercial revenues because it's not, let's say, enough to have a big idea. You need also at some point to commercialize and to generate revenue. So it's a balancing act between developing a solution which is a breakthrough enough, but that can be commercialized early as possible. And unless you have a billionaire above you who can finance without limits, for most entrepreneurs, it's crucial to translate the breakthrough invention into sellable products or services. So I think this is really key for attracting private investors. Now, there are also some, and maybe we will talk later, there are also some public non-dilutive funding that may help also in this art R&D phase before to have a sellable product.
Fabrice, thank you. And it's such a wonderful segue into Joe, who I want to pick up with next, if I may. So you come at this very much from an investor perspective. And so what I really want to understand from you is what do you consider a good investment? What do you look for in an opportunity? What are your best bets, if that makes sense? But I know we talked a little bit about this, is that, you know, at the same time, it's not only that investment that is viable, but what is an impact company as such that makes it, that has that purpose additionality, if I can call it that.
Oh my God. Yeah, I tend to not like to talk about individual deals or transactions. It's more about, my background as an investment manager was always about process. And to keep your own emotions out of the equation, if you're going to invest somebody else's money, you need to manage risk properly. And one of the major risks in investing is your own biases, your own emotions, your own enthusiasm for this deal versus that deal. We see this over the headlines all the time. And so I'll give a generic description of what a good deal looks like. And it really it comes down to the absence of the behavior patterns that you can research and identify of bad deals. So a good deal has the absence of a bad deal's characteristics. Because investing, particularly in the things that Fabrice speaks to, things that are radical, things that are disruptive, trying to create innovation on something, to create something that no one's ever seen before. That's about trying to shape the future. And it's really hard to predict the future, I understand. Nobody can. And so it's about managing the risk as you're placing bets about the future. And that's really comes down to, at the individual transaction level, one of the key pieces of research that came out a couple of years ago, identifying specifically around the issue of transparency, which is one of the things that I'll get to on the components that define an impact deal. It's the absence of proper and voluntary transparency on the part of the CEO is probably the single leading indicator of a bad deal. The absence of proper and voluntary transparency. This came out of some research at a university in Scotland with a whole bunch of actual venture data, looking backwards, studying history, and looking at the successful deals and those that weren't successful, with the benefit of hindsight. So studying history. Trying to predict the future, you can't. And in startup land in particular, especially something that's innovative, it's also in an area that does have a growing appetite to and a change in behavior in the marketplace, as Carrie was speaking to. It's timing is the number one determining factor of success or failure in startups. Timing. You could have everything perfectly right and good transparency and still fail because there wasn't a marketplace for it, because the marketplace's behavior hadn't changed, per Carrie's comments. And so it really comes down to the investors need to be very careful at how they deploy capital so that, yes, they can support the early work and then have the capital available to support those that were making their way through the R&D phase, finding some degree of market acceptance, product market fit, if you will, at least a modicum amount. And then as they're trying to scale and grow their business, to Fabrice's point, the capital is going to be available for them. You know, if we think in terms of how we finance the construction of a building, the contractor doesn't have to go out and chase money every time they have the next phase of the building. They've lined up the financing, they build the building in stages, and it gets inspected, and the next tranche is released. They don't have to go chase the next round of financing to build the next phase of the business. So that's sort of a model of where we should aspire to get to and how we support innovative companies is, yes, go through your R&D phase. There should be a pool of capital available to you that doesn't require you to go through the grant process or trying to get it out of the government or what have you. Equity capital. And then if those that are getting traction, the next tranche would be available for them in a far more efficient way than we experience today. And subsequent follow-on rounds after that. So
Joe, just let me make sure that I've understood you. It's the absence of failure. Okay. It's transparency. It's the timing of capital. Did I get that right?
Well, if you look at the research that's been done on what defines success for entrepreneurial venture, timing is number one. Full stop. Okay. Number one. Number two is product market fit, which has an element of timing to it, right? Is the marketplace there? Are you timing them? Are you too early? Are you too late? Or are you just early enough that you've got at least a tailwind? Execution is third, and then money is fourth, according to if you aggregate. Now, some people break those into smaller, thin sliced pieces of determining factors, but when you roll them up, timing is far away.
Okay,
and
that's helpful. You're going to go on to what the impact company looks like.
Yeah, to your second question. Yeah, an impact company, and again, I always default to Gene Case. I think it was the most succinct summary of what an impact company is. And it's profoundly important, I think, the third point. The first one is, as she points out, transparency, evidence of transparency. The second character trait is a commitment to measurement. Measuring the progress of the business. Are you building a sustainable business to eventually have a sustainable impact on whatever marketplace you wanted to have? But are you building a sustainable business, not just raising money to fund a passion project? So that's the less interesting, just business metrics component. And then third is an intention to have an impact. And when she presented those three character traits, a gentleman spoke up in the audience that she was speaking to, and wanted clarity on that intentionality. And I think this is the most profound point. So look at my business, it looks like a traditional tech company. We're writing software, and it's a piece of software. However, we started in Baltimore because we wanted to create some economic vibrancy and hope for the young technologists in Baltimore to maybe they can stay home and work in startups. Is that an impact company? And her answer was, for the people of Baltimore, it is. And that is a really, really important component, is that impact is in the eye of the investor. Yes, the SDGs define certain things in broad brush strokes, but within the context of even those 17 thin sliced components of impact, there's nuance. And something might appear impactful to one investor and not to another. And they're both right.
That's fantastic. Joe, I love the nuances there, and I want to dig a little bit deeper into that and just open it up a little bit more for discussion. But when we were preparing for this webinar, you all talked to me a little bit about the challenges of tracking success. I mean, I get the business metrics, and I understand that. But one of the tenets of impact investing is obviously measuring the outcomes of the purpose, and particularly the social or environmental purpose. Now, most of you talked to me a little bit about how challenging that is, either because it's not standard or a whole host of other issues. And I really want to actually surface what that is, because sometimes we throw out measurement as if it's a very easy thing to actually do, and we actually know it's not. it's costly. It's not always that easy to actually get right. So what I really wanted to have a discussion about now is to talk about your experiences about actually measuring the outcomes. The impact outcomes is what I really want to focus on. Why is that challenging? What is it that you struggle with? And why does it work or not work? And what have you kind of put aside for a minute? So whoever wants to kick off with that, I know Fabrice and Carrie shared with me some very kind of rock solid challenges around that. And so I'm happy for you to jump in, but Joe, you as well. But maybe either Carrie or Fabrice, which one of you would like to kick off with that question?
I can jump in. So
Fantastic.
I think the measurement, the practice of measuring impact is definitely something that everyone in this space has a grasp on, right? Including the entrepreneurs. And I think the first one is always what to measure and how to measure it. There's a whole bunch, obviously, Jen knows of these, but there's a whole bunch of different standards out there. And I think trying to navigate that is honestly a challenge for most organizations. Most organizations have an understanding of the very basics in terms of how do you measure the problem you're trying to solve from an impact perspective, right? Whether that is helping marginalized people, whether that's greenhouse gas emissions, whatever that is, most people have an understanding of that. But I think trying to navigate just what to measure and then how to measure it is a challenge. And then definitely, I think some of the things that we see is really going back to what type of business are you running? Are you running a good business? Right? I think from a corporate perspective, you'd see like the GRIs, but from a B Corp certification perspective, there's a whole host of different things in there. Governance, for example, diversity, community. How do you measure those things? And so there's a lot that goes into what is a good, impactful business. And to Joe's point, it's perfect, right? That was such a good example of we run a standard business, but we're doing so and we're helping people in Baltimore. So I think getting an understanding of that, and quite frankly, it is hard to measure things. I think one of the hardest things is the social element and the longitudinal necessity, right? So year over year, what is the impact that you're having? That's really hard. We've been measuring our impact and doing so in different ways for almost 15 years, almost the entire time we've been in existence. We've tried lots of different measurement frameworks. We are B Corp certified. We've brought in experts because we've had to, based on our funding. We've engaged with the B Corp broader community on supporting entrepreneurs. And I think that it's important to just say, hey, it's hard, right? And it's, you have to be intentional about it. And it's expensive, right? I have a team of experts that measure impact, and it's a lot of effort.
Yeah, and I'm glad you're acknowledging that it's not easy, and the cost associated with it can in fact actually be challenging as well. Fabrice, you had some thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, I'm happy to add my input on this. Look, I think it really depends from one company and the business, for sure. And of course, any business wants to implement dashboard and track KPIs. Because at some point, they need to also report to maybe the customers or the stakeholders, and so it's of course very important, and particularly if you want to create an impact. Now, in terms of impact, either you can you can track, for example, parameters like how many CO2 emissions you reduce, the waste that you reduce, the water that you can reduce. But also maybe sometimes the impact can be, okay, you have an impact, for example, at the level of a city or a region, a country. I always remember a sentence from Peter Diamandis with a big innovator. He always says, if you want to become a billionaire, impact the life of 1 billion people. And I think he is right, because if you just sell, $1 to 1 billion people, you will become a billionaire. And by the way, you will impact the life of 1 billion people, which I think it's nice. In my opinion, what is probably better is just to track a few parameters, maybe only one, than trying to track a multitude of parameters, because sometimes it's going to be very complicated, etc. If you look, for example, at CO2 emissions, recently, I was part of the founding of a new company, and among the investors, they have a public investors, and the public investor asks, for example, okay, what is, so every year they will need to have a report about the reduction of CO2 emissions with their customers, but also within their business operations, etc. And to be honest, the guy, of course, accepted because he needs the investment, but he has no idea how he's going to measure it. And it will be a challenge for sure. So as soon as you ask too much, I think, to the entrepreneurs, what do you want from them? Is it to build a business or just, to track a lot of parameters? They are not a corporate. So in my opinion, it's better just to have one parameter and to follow the evolution of this parameter. And they see that really, yes, it's on progress or not with just this parameter. And you can change over time, you can change the parameter if we see that it's not the good one, for sure.
And I agree with that narrowness completely. Otherwise, it lands up being a burden on the management of the organization and potentially puts the entire investment at risk. Joe, coming back to your point about how it often is in the eye of the investor or the nuances from that perspective, it seems to me that a lot of the kind of measurement or understanding what impact success actually looks like really depends on almost a case-by-case basis. Would you agree with that observation on my part?
Yes, very much so. Because again, it is in the eye of the beholder as to whether you're having an impact or not. And on the point of measurement, it's really hard to even measure accurately, even 1 point. If it's CO2 emissions, okay, how are you tracking your supply chain? Your vendors' CO2 footprint. It's really hard, even if you pick one. And this is the bugaboo, quite frankly. We could spend hours on, the debate as to whether EV cars are actually green or not when you're looking at the cost of the mining of the raw materials that go into the batteries, et cetera, et cetera. So, it is a slippery slope measurement, is. And I think
that's quite a debate about electric cars.
Yes, it is. And I think it applies to, we've got startups that are clients that call themselves environmentally friendly, but I look at their packaging and I think, are you out of your mind? That's not environmentally friendly, right? It's more optics than it is reality. And so these are the challenges, without a doubt. I think any entrepreneur has to keep in mind that the relevant impact metrics, you can say this is our intentions, and we will be measuring it when it's time to measure it. But the key measurements per the GINS report, as we talked earlier in prep, is the business metrics are the most relevant for the first 3 to 5 years. You can talk about what you will be measuring and set the infrastructure in place and start escalating your efforts at measuring that in the field impact, whatever that might be that you've defined yourself. But the most relevant for the first 3 to 5 years are business metrics. Otherwise, you're not going to have a business. So you have a sustainable.
So it seems like it's almost like you want those impact metrics to be as closely related to the kind of management metrics that an entrepreneur would use to run their business in any event. Would that be right?
It's a hard one to generalize. I'm not sure I could accept that generalization because building a business has certain components. Right. And then depending, again, like the Baltimore example I gave earlier, their metrics are just employees. That's a really easy one. Right. And the irony is, just to run an interesting point on that, there's some great research that shows, big mistakes startups go through. And we're seeing layoffs now going on like crazy because startups get a big funding round and they overhire. Well, if that Baltimore example did the same thing, they're maximizing their impact, but that makes them vulnerable as a business. Okay, so running the business metrics is always going to be the most important one, so you can have a sustainable impact. And the right way to hire, regardless of your funding run, is a measured hiring practice, regardless of whether you have a big chunk of money. You don't go hire a bunch, but we see it all the time. right? We're hiring, and then you got to go buy computers and matching T-shirts, and then you got the cultural assimilation, and then you got to then you got a big layoff because you overspent and you overhired because those are vanity metrics, right?
Yeah.
And so it really does. It is situational, case by case. But the things that are fundamental truths are you got to be around to have the impact you intend. That your investors really do.
And exactly. And the viability of the business is crucial to that anyway. So again, Joe, you've given me a fantastic segue, and I'm going to just drop into this particular element of it. But one of the things that we know is that failure is a feature almost of entrepreneurial success. In other words, it's almost a friend, as it were. Some might even question that, given some of our most intractable challenges, if failure when innovating for purpose may be unethical at worst or ill-considered at best, especially when we don't have the time or people's lived experience is at stake. So from a climate point of view, one would argue that we just don't have the time to have too many failures before we find success. And obviously, when people's lived experience is at the heart of what an entrepreneur might do or impact, there's a big question about whether you're experimenting in that kind of context. Yet experimentation is so crucial to innovation. How do you deal with failure in this kind of context with the businesses that you deal with? Carrie, maybe I can ask you to go first, and then I'll jump to Fabrice if he's got some thoughts, and Joe to follow.
So I think two things come to mind, and this is with the businesses that we support, the entrepreneurs, but I think just in general, right? I think that when we think about it is, we've heard this over and over from all of us on here. What is the intention? What is the intention for what you're trying to do? And are you being thoughtful with that intention, right? Because all of these things, life is all about experimentation and innovation. That's the crux, right? You have to be innovative, so you do take risks. But I think it is, how do you thoughtfully do so, right? In a way that is creating the least amount of harm, hopefully good, but the least amount of harm. And I definitely think when it comes to things that involve humans in a big way, you really have to take extra measure, right? We do a lot in responsible tech and support a lot of entrepreneurs who are developing out responsible tech solutions. And so the human is at the core of that. So I think there's the intentionality. And then I think, what is the relationship, right? So our theory of change is really focused on increasing relational wealth. And this really comes down to the humans behind it. Because at the end of the day, are we trying? Are we trying to have better relationships? Are we trying to support power injustices, or are we trying to dismantle them? So I think of it oftentimes as, the intentionality and the care and the way that we engage from a relationship perspective. And you can see that with entrepreneurs. This is where it's almost impossible to measure, right? How do you measure this? But it really comes down to, who are the humans behind things? Out of the thousands of entrepreneurs we've supported, I think there's only been a couple where we had to pull back and said, you know what, something does not feel right here. Something doesn't feel right. Maybe it's because we've selected well, maybe it's because the humans that are in that. But I think in general, people are trying, and they're trying to engage from a place of integrity and ethics. Okay. But we have to experiment.
Yeah, of course. It's finding that fine balance, isn't it? That's fantastic. Fabrice, do you have some thoughts?
Yes, look, for me, failure is part of innovation, and we know that we need a lot of innovation with impact, building of company building and sustainability. We need a lot of innovation. So for me, it's part of it. I always repeat the same, if either you can just sit at the station and see the train passing in front of you, or you can be a passenger on board the train, or you can be the driver of the train, or maybe the one that build infrastructure or build the train. And for me, the answer is very simple. What we must have much more is builders, is doers. So the drivers or the builders, of the train infrastructure is what we need. If we want to build a better future for the next generations, is what we need. We need more builders. And I think so for me, the risk of not doing something is much bigger than the risk of just trying. And now you can minimize somehow the risk. And for example, in my coaching program, I teach the asymmetry of risk. It's something that Richard Branson popularized quite a lot. So if you have to try to minimize as much the risk, but if the reward is really very huge, then you have this asymmetry of risk, and so you should do it. So basically, I think it's something that you can also try to at least minimize as much as possible. Now, failure is part of the entrepreneurship journey. We have to live with, but there are ways, if you are well prepared, if you are at the right timing, as Joe mentioned. So there are certain, let's say, steps that you cannot just shortcut. And if you try to do your best, you can minimize the risk. So failure is something that is, of course, you cannot avoid totally, but you can minimize for sure.
And I love your opportunity cost way of looking at it. Is that the cost of not doing anything is far greater. So thank you for that.
Exactly.
Joe, some thoughts from you in terms of failure and how you manage it?
Well, first, one of the great quotes is Gene Kleiner of Kleiner Perkins, one of the founders of Kleiner Perkins. He says, "I want to invest in an entrepreneur that hasn't failed before." And that's a really important point, is that failure is not only a natural byproduct of chasing innovation, but from a seasoned investor's perspective, it's actually a strength. And so the entrepreneurs, that should give them comfort in taking that risk, in that even if you fail, you've just got to learn lessons of what not to do. And you might have earned more credibility in the eyes of seasoned investors for your next gig. Now, as an investor, it's really important to, as I've said before, manage risk. And there's ways to manage these risks. And it all comes down to, at its basic core point, your capital deployment. Diversification, for crying out loud. It's the only free lunch in investing is diversification. Risk of failure or risk of loss, from an investor's perspective, is called non-systematic risk. That is the actual academic label for transaction risk or deal risk. And that is not, that risk is not diffused through more due diligence, particularly with startups, because you can't predict the future. And startups are about shaping and building a future. The only way to manage that risk is through diversification. Great risk, the great mistake most investors make in investing in startups. It's viewed a risky asset class. It's riskier than it needs to be because investors are investing wrong. Second, given that timing is the number one determining factor, then managing timing risk from an investor's perspective is the most important one. And that is actually, in academic terms, called systematic risk. And in public markets, there's a little practice called dollar cost averaging. And that is specifically a disciplined way to manage timing risk. And yet most investors in startups don't deploy any sort of systematic staged investment over multiple time periods to manage timing risk. So at the end of the day, we do need to improve how capital is deployed to support startups, so we can support more startups at the seed level, taking those high-risk experimental innovation chasing pursuits, impact or not, and then let some of them fail, but have your capital deployed properly so that you're, ironically, a properly diversified seed stage portfolio supports more startups by definition, which is actually healthy for the ecosystem. You're training more entrepreneurs on what to do and what not to do. It's actually a best practices for both parties, but it's not something that's widely deployed in how we fund innovative companies. And that's really where the investors need to check themselves and check their behavior and their egos and self-perception. They can predict the future, because most investors are the problem. They're investing wrong, chasing shiny objects, oftentimes because everybody's doing it, whether it's impact or not. And that's a misallocation of capital, and it hurts the actual health of the innovation ecosystems because the money's not being deployed properly.
Yeah, I love the way you flipped that, Joan. Thank you. And just to take a moment, I would really want to encourage our audience, if you've got questions, we've got two great ones at the moment, which I'm going to get to right now. But if you do have questions for our panelists, please feel free to put them in the chat. We may not be able to get to all of them, but we'll certainly try. It helps us to get some good input from the audience to make the conversation more relevant for you. So, Carrie, I'm going to put you a little bit on the spot, but we've got a lovely one from the floor that says, do you believe that venture capital or even for-profit impact investors create a pressure to maximize financial returns, often at the expense of impact? And I think that's where this question is going, is that do you think founders are aware of other forms of capital that might be available to them under those circumstances?
Oh, this is a great question.
I hear the wry laugh.
Yeah, well, so I think at the end of the day, market mechanisms are exactly what we need, right? And so we're all about how do we redesign capitalism in a way that actually works for people on the planet. So, I absolutely think that it's a good thing to have these pressures to make profit. At the end of the day, you can't have impact if you're not a successful business, right? You've been hearing that. So I don't want to throw out this notion of like, oh, wait a minute here, should we be focusing too much on profit at the expense of others? I think it's a yes and, right? I think this is where at all times, people have the opportunity to take money from investors of their choice. And I do think that it's important to really say, do my values align with the money that I'm taking to the extent that I can? I mean, there are times that, quite frankly, people, to keep their businesses running, they saddle up with investors that they maybe don't feel quite as good about. I've had people say, hey, you know what? This investor really doesn't care about my ESG report. They don't really care about this. And so I think at the end of the day, it's kind of putting all of that into perspective. What can you live with? And yeah, it would be fantastic if we had more investors, more impact investors, more investors in general who cared about running good businesses, right? Those that are good for the planet and for people and that are well run. So, but market mechanisms are where it's at.
Sure. And maybe I can also just add to that is that sometimes if those market mechanisms are at work, if the entrepreneur is not comfortable with the financial pressure performance, then they perhaps they're not ready to consider that form of capital just yet. And maybe there are others that they would look at. Okay. And go for it, Carrie.
No, I was going to say, yeah. And there's also different business models, right? So I think people have to understand what they're comfortable with. But yeah, let's actually redefine capitalism in the way it currently is designed for most of the world right now.
Okay, thank you. Another question. Experimentation, I think this is speaking pretty much to our kind of discussion on failure and how to use it or leverage it. The suggestion is that experimentation is important, at least in healthcare, which is an area that's close to my heart at the moment. Aren't many companies successful, or many successful companies, and I assume in the healthcare space, incrementalists? In other words, obviously doing things stage by step or step by step by step. Any thoughts on that, Fabrice or Joe?
Yeah, look, I don't have a lot of experience in health, let's say, or medical, let's say, companies. But yes, experimentation is key for sure. If you want to innovate, you need to experiment a lot. Now, do we have to experiment incrementally? I think is the sense of the question. Or do we have to make, let's say, big leaps? I think it depends, but for sure, what you need to try to do, in my opinion, is to try to think really out of the box, and to try to see, okay, how I can have an order of magnitude of improvement rather than just an increment, because it's how you push beyond, let's say, the limits, and how you will create this kind of crazy ideas or radical solutions that we are looking for. If you just look at some incremental, let's say, improvements, probably you are just going to have let's say, a small improvement to an existing solution. And is it enough? In most cases, I think it's not enough. So maybe Joe can complement my answer.
Well,
Go
yeah,
for it, Joe.
yeah. There's sadly, again, having watched the venture industry for almost 30 years now and studying it and watching the ebbs and flows of where the money flows, because ultimately that is the leading indicator of where innovation will follow. Is the money gets mobilized and then the innovation follows, or the startups follow. It isn't always material innovation. And that's what creates these tidal waves of FOMO. You know, do we need 12 scooter companies all cluttering up our sidewalks and every street corner? No. Or how many food delivery companies, or fill in the blank, right? I was at a meeting years ago here in Austin, and the guy did a presentation, and he said there was 187 food delivery companies that got funded. Now, how much of that is innovation? None of it is materially, right? And so, yeah, defining really this overused word of disruption. Does it really disrupt, or is it incremental? And the incremental innovation oftentimes is just bringing software to and a little bit of cost savings, faster, cheaper, better. But it's oftentimes faster, cheaper, better is an easier business model to get funded. And remember, money dictates where the direction, unfortunately, now. So it is this dynamic, right? The incremental gets funded. The radical stuff is either grant funding or R&D funding, or harder to fund and more meaningful, true innovation. And the answer is, I don't know the answer. It is the marketplace. What I do know is we need more money, and we need more money in the marketplace invested better, so that entrepreneurs aren't having to waste so damn much time chasing money, whether they're going after incremental or they're going after radical innovation.
Sure. So Joe, let's build on that, because you've talked about it a couple of times of the market needing more money. And when we were preparing for this call, you talked specifically about tax incentives, for example. You mentioned and referenced in the US, and Fabrice also shared some of them that are available in Europe. And it's a feature in many parts of the world. For example, even in the part of the world that I come from, there are also tax incentives to invest in small innovative businesses as well. Do you think that those types of incentives have worked to drive capital to these types of businesses?
Well, again, that's a generalization. I'm always reluctant.
I'm sorry for the generalizations. You can be specific if you'd like to.
Well, I can't speak to the U.S. incentives. All right, I can't speak to the international ones and whether they've worked. I have heard from a lot of startups that moved here from England that the UK ones work quite well. But unfortunately, it's that early seed money, and it's not huge money. It's very compelling benefits, but there's no depth of funding in England. That's why they had to move here for seed plus or A round and beyond, because those tax incentives. So again, the form has to follow the function you want, and the tax policy itself has to accomplish what the intentionality is. And at least in Washington, that's rarely the case. Right? It's generally it gets torn apart for political purposes and otherwise. The two that are the most compelling in the United States that I'm intimately aware of, very few people even know about. So I think the universal answer is no, they don't work due to a lack of knowledge. And I've done presentations for decades now on these tax laws. And sometimes the same person comes to me 3 and 4 times and says, what were those tax laws again? And what I found is, at least in the US, in my experience, is that tax law, tax incentives, taxes in general is a subject that nobody really likes to even think about. That's why I've got an accountant to worry about that, right? And so even if you're talking to them about it, they're angel investors, an angel investor group or whatever else, VCs, even if you're talking at them and their eyes are blinking, they're not listening, and they're thinking to themselves, that's why I got an accountant, because I hate taxes. And so I think it's a grossly underutilized opportunity, certainly in the United States. And it could and would mobilize a ton more money if more people knew about them and were less afraid of them. But that's a human trait. So I'm not, like I said, I've been pushing that rock up the hill and trying to get more people to wear them so they'd utilize them so that more money would get invested. And it's an interesting challenge. I'll leave it at that.
All right, fantastic. We've got a couple of questions from the audience. The one I'm going to direct at Fabrice, just to give you a little bit of a heads up, because I want you to expand on some of the investments that you've done in that are either done or are considering in other markets other than Europe or the US. And I'll come back to that in a minute. And then the second question that's from our audience, I'm going to use as a kind of a lightning round just to wrap up, because I think it's a great question to be able to actually do that. So Fabrice, there's a question from the audience about how sustainability compares in other parts of the world. And what I wanted to perhaps direct you to is that you talked a little bit in your opening comments today about some of the investments that you were considering in sub-Saharan Africa, for example. And how do you think about it in terms of more emerging markets, or in comparison to, say, Europe, or comparison to, say, the US, if you're investing in those markets?
Yeah, look, I think Europe is going massively into sustainability, for sure. You know that we have the Green Deal in Europe, so this has driven quite a lot of investment in climate tech. So there are many funds, and the European Commission also invests directly. So just to to complement what Joe mentioned, it's true that in UK there are some nice incentive for business angels. Also in Belgium, it works very well. Now, for the follow-up rounds, for example, the European Investment Fund, they can invest into funds, for example, dedicated to climate tech. So they can invest sometimes even 40% of the size of the fund. So it's quite significant. The European Union also can invest, have grant or also in equity investment possibilities to startups to scale. So I think there are quite a lot of mechanisms that work quite well. If we go out of Europe, I see, and I'm quite present there. I see that Middle East is investing a lot into climate tech and sustainability. Because for them it's key to somehow build their future. And just to comment something that Joe mentioned, yes, as Peter Drucker always said, if the best way to predict the future is to build it. And I think in Middle East, they are building the future, clearly. Africa,
Fantastic.
Of course, Africa is struggling, as we know, but it's going quite well in a few countries. For example, with one of my companies, Man Electric, we have now contracts in South Africa, in other parts in Western Africa too. So Africa, I think, is becoming, let's say, more resilient. They have also a young generation of entrepreneurs. And so I think the future might be not so bad for Africa. I think it might be even bright in Africa with this new generation. So this is interesting.
It warms my heart. I'm going to round off here with a little bit of a lightning round. And you've literally got 10 seconds to say this. But speaking of more money is the question in the marketplace. What do you think, as panelists, the investing environment will look like in the second half of 2023? Carrie, quick thought. Are you optimistic, pessimistic?
Pessimistic. Sadly pessimistic.
Okay. All right. Fabrice.
Yes, unfortunately pessimistic too, because the market is it's not great for the moment, and I don't think that it will improve. Analysts are saying that it will probably improve by mid of next year only. So, all right. Unfortunately.
Joe?
Well, it's hard to argue with the logic of that. Given that we're launching a fund ourselves, I have to say optimistic.
Okay.
Because and what makes me optimistic is the marketplace is changing. The venture industry is changing, and that's the good news.
All right. Well, fantastic, and thank you. One of our CEO often talks about the fact that transformative change requires deliberate, focused, coordinated action from visionaries to committed to a new future. And in the entrepreneurial space, Carrie, Fabrice, and Joe, thank you for being those visionaries. I really appreciate it. And Monica, with that, I'll hand back to you.
Thank you so much. What a great conversation. And I was frantically taking notes and stuff as you guys were all talking. And some of the things that just stood out for me was thinking about the need for behavioral change, and the need to go beyond conventional solutions, kind of the crazy ideas component, but that you have to be able to commercialize them. And finally, that, as we all know with entrepreneurship, failure is a big part of, the entrepreneur ecosystem. But the risk of not trying, I think, what did you say, is bigger than not trying at all. So I thought, oh, wow, that really, is very impactful. And thinking about the students I work with, trying to encourage them to take that risk. But great conversation. And with that, I really want to thank all of our speakers, Joe, Fabrice, and Carrie. And then, of course, Dean for moderating this great conversation. We will have another conversation in the fall, so please look for that. And with that, I want to thank everybody for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.